Hi, my name is Chris Drew. I'm a public library worker in Springfield, Missouri. Recently graduated with an MLIS from UM, and I have a BA in English from Truman State. I have an interest in alternative newspapers, particularly historical and regional ones. I discovered Over the Rainbow in the Springfield Greene County Library's local history department information files. Took this project from there. I could probably use a better understanding and grounding in the women's movement of the 70s, if I'm being honest, but I tried to do my best. I really thought this publication itself was a find I wanted to explore. So let's explore it. In June 1977, a small group of active participants in the local women's movement sent out a newsletter titled Over the Rainbow, Springfield's only feminist newspaper. You can see it right there. Come out wherever you are. They go on to write, we believe there is a feminist community in Springfield, and whether you are interested in passing ERA or offering, let's start over. Great. Hi, my name is Chris Drew. I'm a public library worker in Springfield, Missouri. Recently graduated with an MLIS from UM, and I have a BA in English from Truman State. I have an interest in alternative newspapers, particularly historical and regional ones. I discovered Over the Rainbow in Springfield Greene County Library's local history department's information files. I took this project from there. I could use a better grounding in the women's movement of the 70s, if I'm being totally honest, but I tried to do my best here. I really thought the publication itself was a find I wanted to explore. So let's explore it. In June 1977, a small group of active participants in the women's movement sent out a newsletter titled Over the Rainbow, Springfield's only feminist newspaper. Come out wherever you are. They go on to write, we believe there is a feminist community in Springfield, and whether you are interested in passing ERA, offering support to rape victims, enjoying women's art, or bitching about sexism in the media, we think we can work together. We want a women's center in Springfield. All we need is money, manual labor, and dedication. Each of us has something to give. We have heard over and over that Springfield is too conservative to support a women's center. Well, the whole point of the movement is changing old patterns of belief and behavior. They go on to underscore behind every successful woman is a women's center. The Women's Center clearly central to the mission, this navigation for space through the building, but also through print here, part of a national trend in this era of second wave feminist activity throughout the 70s and into the 80s. In the book Finding the Movement, Anne Inc. argues that between 1960 and 80, women constituted feminist activism by intervening in established public spaces, by creating new kinds of spaces. Inc. suggests the second wave of feminism took shape at least partially as a popular movement around the limitations and possibilities of local geographies. I think you can see all that right here in their intro statement. As a folk artifact, Over the Rainbow is an important localized picture of this wave of change in socio-political communication and organizing that women were doing outside of the mainstream and which just preceded the digital revolution. In the newsletter, they go on to report on the first issue of the newsletter on the International Women's Year Conference, which I think is a great picture of activism at the time and reflects the diversity and the struggle of the women's movement that this newsletter and community are situated in. You can see a discussion about the anti-ERA slate versus the pro-ERA activists that attended the convention, and in this case, the antis won out on the vote. I think another great example of that is the important note you'll see here in issue 2. Throughout the record of Over the Rainbow, they walk this line, trying to appeal to as broad an audience as possible. A clear and important part of their culture is appealing to images that suggest things far outside of militant feminism, particularly here in association with the Women's Center. You can see in the important note, feminism does not conflict with knitting, crocheting, needlepoint, etc. All these can be done at the center. Feminism does not say what a woman cannot do. It emphasizes what a woman can do. And what a woman can do is limited only by her imagination. Um, by issue 2, which is coming out in July of 77, they announced they've incorporated, they devote most of the front page to the Women's Center. They also make the local paper the news leader. All of the local coverage you see in other news sources are about the founding of the Women's Center early on here. The group had put together a fairly large meeting, made the paper, elected a board to incorporate in a very formal manner for opening the Women's Center. The president, Diane Wood Staub, president of the board, explained the center would not be totally feminist, which again points to their environment. The newspaper describes it as potentially housing an art gallery, resource center, shelter, and care space for abused women, and perhaps doing all that through supporting organizations that already exist and just need some space. Issue 3 presents a little bit more of what's going on there. You see the Women's Center, 945 East St. Louis. They found it. Gives you some things that they need and are requesting to help get together for that. And you're also going to see the Feminist Copy House they're helping to promote. The now sponsored ERA events they're helping to promote. Women's Inc., the incorporated organization that at this point is very much associated with Over the Rainbow and was core to the Women's Center project. Its board is composed of active participants in the women's movement, but with pretty diverse views. Some were affiliated with NOW, Planned Parenthood, some on pro and some on the anti-ERA organizations. The address of the building, 945 East St. Louis, is now an area that's been redeveloped near Hammond's Tower and the Springfield Chamber of Commerce. I've read articles that describe the nearby area on Walnut as the center of gay life in the 80s. So I want to associate this address potentially with sort of what would have been the radical area of Springfield, just east of the square downtown, essentially. But the Rainbow does not really touch on gay or lesbian culture much throughout the publication, as far as I've seen. And I think this mimeograph newsletter or mimeograph quote is really valuable. I think as a mimeographed artifact, that's one of the values of Over the Rainbow and artifacts like it. It presents an accessible and localized. This form of self-publication connoted rejection of external control over a community's message and production of a self-determined cultural content. Mimeography linked marginalized groups to a recurring motif of independence and aided in the construction of the community. Over the Rainbow really represents a small link in a chain of printing and use of the press that has been and still is important to a number of social movements, part of a long history that is still ongoing. In the modern era, we have digital publications, instant communication, articles, and information. I think these digital spaces work remarkably like the ephemeral space of the print material here, creating a framework through which ideas can be realized and shared and community developed. Mimeograph was probably one of the most important new technologies for printing in the 20th century, and almost any small group, even an individual, could put together paper and reproduce copies quickly. And particularly for marginalized communities, this meant small groups or individuals could connect across space and time. Without a lot of other resources, they could still take an action that could put themselves in the public eye and in the eyes of one another and build that community. I have a few good examples of that. Vice versa, this is a lesbian publication published in 1947, probably one of the oldest examples of a mimeographed zine or newsletter or newspaper. Something a little more contemporary to Over the Rainbow, New Directions for Women in New Jersey. This came out in '72. New Directions, after it dropped the New Jersey bit, would go on to be a pretty standard magazine after a while. From the mid-60s to the late 70s, there's really a terrific explosion of underground and alternative publications. Lots of them are mimeoed, but lots more are professional or semi-professional. Some have some real award-winning journalism. Some go on to become, like New Directions, essentially normal magazines. The Movement is a great example. This comes out from SNCC. And this is a very standard sort of civil rights, anti-war movement newspaper, something like The Rag, maybe more typical of your college campus alternative paper, not quite as professional. John McMillan gives a detailed history and analysis of this era in a book, Smoking Typewriters, which runs up to '78. McMillan caps the movement off with a major conference of news weeklies in Seattle, a formal conference unlike previous iterations, a product of the alternative weekly paper market's professionalization, which separated it from the more underground radical papers of the '60s. By the late '70s, that market's really dying, and you see a few kind of survive to become more mainstream, less radical. High Times is an interesting example, Village Voice and Chicago Reader, two others that it survived at this time period to become a little more professionalized. I think the Riverfront Times of St. Louis is even an interesting example, something that came out in the late '70s. Certainly you consider it an alternative paper, but not as radical as some of that early anti-war civil rights associated things. Agatha Baines gives a broader feminist history of printing in her work, Liberation in Print. Baines also has a nice dissertation, Free Our Sisters, Free Ourselves, Locating U.S. Feminism Through Periodicals 1970 to '83, which is a nice, concise examination of this era. Jennifer Gilbert also presents a great picture of this era in the case study of Duke University's Feminary, a feminist space that built community through feminist press. Gilbert writes, the feminist movement of the US in the 60s and 70s was a remarkable experiment in mass movement building that marked the beginning of a pronounced change for American women. The emergence of a feminist press was a cornerstone for the movement. It helped create a community of women bound by their desire to fundamentally alter the way American society treated them. In 1976, the Feminary held their first big conference on the topic of the feminist press, and I think it's just an interesting thing to note, the sign of shift towards the predominance of the women's movement as the social movement of the time, and as a sign of the ongoing absence of women's voices in the alternative press, that we see big feminist press and printing conferences that are radical at the same time as we see a shift towards relatively moderate and commercial interests in your typical and alternative newspapers. And of course, issue 4 comes up next. You can see that as clearly the activists in Springfield are using this publication the way that it's been described in the preceding quotes. It's really a center of part of their movement. Their mission to realize the center here, still being navigated. The center takes up most of the attention here, and it seems like it had a lot of work that needed to be done. As with any alternative organization, there's a pressing need to get and keep people involved, and you can see them struggling with that in their call for involvement with the center. Have you been turned off or burned up by the Women's Center, they say right off the bat, so really trying to address that. Unfortunately, the center would be a blessing and a curse. By the next issue, they'd been informed that that the building was simply not up to code. They'd been told by the city. And this issue also sees the Rainbow take on more active life outside of the Women's Center. They really clarify that the Women's Inc., the corporation created to develop the center, and Over the Rainbow are distinct entities. They devote the issue mostly to the ERA and political involvement in for women in Springfield. And they specify that Women's Inc. does not have a stance on this. Another example of the unique situation of the movement at the time as both apolitical and deeply political. In order to accomplish the goals of the center, it seems it was important for those active to create a big tent coalition, probably work in what they termed a practical framework given the circumstances. The next several issues follow a similar format, updates on the Women's Center and Women's Inc., a listing of events and special reports on specific topics such as women's employment and business, women in the arts and religion, all tailored to the area. Event examples include more feminist coffee shop nights, women's writing and music groups, NOW and ERA meetings, presentations on the experience of Native American women, Ozarks Lesbian Alliance meetings, and workshops on child advocacy and helping battered women. By 78, moving into the second year of their existence, the deadline for the passage of the ERA rapidly approaching, and it begins taking up more and more of the space in the Rainbow, and presumably in the lives of the activists involved in the movement. This is from issue 11, March 78. When forming the center, they were very clear about not taking a stance on the ERA. The folks editing the Rainbow at this point, very clear and ready to take a stance. Volume 2, issue 1, this is the banner, and this would be the banner for all the issues of volume 2, ERA clearly taking a center stage. This issue also profiles a parenting workshop and features an article on the Hyde Amendment, as you can see there, which obviously is a very political article to take on. Volume 2, number 2 is the last issue that I was able to access and make use of. The State Historical Society has at least one issue after this. I'm not sure if others were published. This one is almost all about the ERA. There's a nice note there about the Self-Help Center in Joplin, which again calls back to the project of developing spaces. At this point, as far as I can tell, the Women's Center in Springfield, that project had essentially ended. From the brief comments in early issues of the Rainbow, it's pretty clear that there's a lack of resources, and particularly and potentially a lack of strong organization and coordination. And you can also read the shift in the magazine from the center to the ERA, suggesting to me that those perhaps more conservative members of the movement fell by the wayside over time. And by this point, a smaller, perhaps more politicized group may have had a tough time building a center, or may just not have been interested in it as a project. But either way, they weren't working on that as much. Over the Rainbow represents sort of the nimbleness of the communication of the era, I think, and the hyper-localized stage of media that we were in, and in many ways are still in. It's also an example of how fleeting that printed space's existence can be. This, 14-issue run, as far as I know, hardly takes up a year worth of existence, but accomplished a lot and said a lot. I think an interesting contemporary parallel could be found in Julie Joplin magazine. This is a web-based magazine based out of Joplin, focuses on feminism in the region in very much the same way that Over the Rainbow did. You could easily imagine Over the Rainbow having sort of articles that Julie publishes now. As a folk artifact, Over the Rainbow was produced outside of any commercial enterprise by and for its community, embedded with the experiences of the people that created and read it. It represents an attempt to create and hold space for women who needed and wanted to be part of the movement, and it wanted to create and bolster physical spaces to empower and protect women, which is a central charge of this era of feminism. It shows how, in many ways, that movement was politically diverse and how its organizers attempted to deal with the predominant political issue of the ERA. It faced challenges with maintaining commitment, as the quick end of the women's movement Women's Center and the 14-issue run of Over the Rainbow attest to. A small example of one of thousands and thousands of similar projects that existed throughout the country, often in small runs for just a few years. Over the Rainbow and artifacts like it are a down-to-earth picture of the past and a useful backdrop for contextualizing our present. I think I've shown how one can squeeze a little value out of these really interesting publications. Thank you.